people gonna look at me like a monster. I'm not a monster, I'm just an addict. I was so out of my mind, and it was like I was out of character, and I got what I got coming, and I deserve it. I will write a formal apology to her family that they probably don't want to hear, but I will do it anyway. I don't want a circus made out of this. I just want to go to court and get it over with. I don't remember what I did. I just remember when I came through that it had happened, and it was just disgusting.
It was the evening of January the 26th, 2017 in Cleveland, Ohio. The sun was setting, employees were driving home, and the family of Alianna DeFreeze were desperately searching for their daughter who had failed to return home after supposedly being at school. Now, I say supposedly because Alianna actually never made it to class that morning. It's just that her school failed to tell her parents about this. And well, this was only the beginning of a long series of mistakes. Welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and before we begin today, please do consider subscribing to see more true crime, strange and dark stories. And now with that said, please grab yourself a coffee, pull up a seat and get ready for the deep dive. This is the case of Alianna DeFreeze. It was on the evening of January 26, 2017 that the city of Cleveland became aware of some rather disturbing news. It was on that day that 14-year-old Alianna DeFreeze failed to return home after a day out at school. Now, this was immensely worrying for her parents. However, it was only after calling the school that they learned of some even more disturbing details. Alianna had never actually turned up that morning. You see, the school had actually forgotten to tell her parents that she never made it into class that day. And now she'd been unaccounted for more than 9 hours. So, where could she have gone and why did she disappear so abruptly? Well, according to her parents, this must have been against her will. Alianna was not the type of person to do this. So, before we talk about Alianna and what happened to her that day, it is probably worth me setting the scene and talking about where all of this happened, because Cleveland does provide some context. You see, Cleveland has seen better days. In the early 1900s, the city's population exploded, before eventually reaching the 1 million figure mark between the 1930s and the 1950s. Now, this was mostly thanks to becoming a major industrial and commercial destination through America's great manufacturing era. Big car makers at the time were situated here, including Peerless, Chandler, and Winton. In fact, back then, a lot of money was pumped into Cleveland, and it was known as America's 6th largest city. However, by the 1960s, Cleveland's economy began to slow down, and residents increasingly sought new housing in the suburbs. Eventually, restructuring in the manufacturing industry pushed many jobs away from the city, and unfortunately, as housing discrimination and redlining became more prominent, violence surged in the area, and the Great Depression further eroded the city's economic base. By the year 2010, the city's population was just a third of what it was in the 50s, and as you can imagine, this was not good for its economic health. As a result, by the year 2015, the city council reported that there were more than 12,000 abandoned homes in Cleveland. In some areas, the place essentially feels like a ghost town, and a dangerous one at that. Back in 2017, that 12,000 figure was thankfully declining. But even still, officials were reporting upward of more than 5,000 empty homes in the city. Homes that act as opportunities to conceal all sorts of crime and bad behavior. I'm talking drugs, violence, assault, murder. Nobody felt safe around them, to be honest. And although the numbers may have been down, for anyone living next to one of these, well, it was still one too many. We will come back to these abandoned homes soon for a very good reason, but for now, let's focus our story on Alianna DeFreeze. Born on June 12, 2002, to her parents Damon DeFreeze and Donesha Cooper, the small family began their life together in the city of Detroit, found across the waters of Lake Erie. While Alianna was still a baby, her parents decided to relocate to Cleveland to make a better future for themselves. And although her parents didn't stay together throughout her entire childhood, they would try their hardest to ensure that their relationship did not affect Alianna's upbringing. Moving forward, she lived with her mother, but her father was still always in the picture and supporting his daughter in the many ways that a dad should. Things like taking her to school, fun trips out together on weekends, and acting as a moral compass. Together but apart, Danesha and Damon raised Alianna with as much love and care as possible. But sadly, as the time passed by, they would notice that their daughter began to trail behind on her schoolwork quite significantly. This leading her school, East Prep and Village Prep Woodland Hills, to suspect a disability. Now, although Alianna did have her disability, she would never let it hold her back. She would also have a very happy childhood surrounded by a loving family, including a younger half-brother. Alianna was what you would call a girly girl. Her favourite colour was purple, and she enjoyed playing with baby dolls well into her teenage years. Her mother would go on to say that she was enthusiastic to help around the home, and that furthermore, she was a sweet and happy-go-lucky girl. Now, due to the extra support that she sometimes needed, Alianna's parents were naturally more worried about her safety, placing them on the more protective side. I mean, to be honest, I do kind of understand this. I mean, Nero isn't even human, and I'm always worried about his health and safety. It was at the age of 14 that they decided to let their daughter make her own way on the bus. And it did make perfect sense too, because that bus stop was right in front of a police station. So naturally, they assumed she was safe. In addition to this, they were also comforted by the fact that her school were well aware of her route and her condition. And so if she ever failed to make it to class, they promised to call her parents. And unfortunately, this takes us to the beginning of our terrible story, which happened on January 26th, 2017. And as you know, this promise was broken. This day was a very usual Thursday, with nothing out of the ordinary. Danesha helped Alianna prepare for school, as she had an early tutoring session at 7 AM that morning. After getting dressed in her school uniform, that being tan pants and a white shirt, the pair then walked to the nearest bus stop for her to be dropped off. At 6:45 AM, Danesha kissed her daughter goodbye and watched her board the bus, which, by the way, was located on East 149th Street, just north of Kinsman Avenue. No surprise, but Danesha and her mother expected Alianna to walk through the front door later that afternoon. The women had plans to spend the dinner together as a family, but strangely enough, as 4 PM passed by just as silently as it arrived, there was still no sign of Alianna. This was very concerning information. It wasn't like her to be late. Trying to keep calm, Danesha called the prep school to see if she was still there. However, when reception picked up the phone, she was told that not only was Alianna not present, but that furthermore, she never even made it to school that morning. Well, this was news to Danesha, and in a panic, she informed the police immediately. With Alianna being a minor, the authorities quickly sprang into action. As a result, a citywide search began, with initial investigations conducted on the bus that she alighted at East 149th Street. Now, thankfully, this bus that she boarded did actually have a surveillance system installed into it. Alianna could be seen getting on the bus before then making her journey all the way to East 93rd and Kinsman Avenue, where she was then due to change buses. Now, rather conveniently, this particular bus stop was located in a built-up area with plenty of businesses around. And so, the only next logical step was to check all surveillance cameras surrounding that bus stop. From here, Alianna could be seen crossing the street at 93rd, as she had every other school day. It seemed that the surveillance footage was actually doing a very effective job at tracking her movements. Unfortunately, at least for a while, things would go dark after this, and she failed to show up for her usual connecting bus. For now, the only other thing that the authorities could do was request surveillance footage from all businesses surrounding these two bus stops. Now, what I will say here is it looks like Cleveland has a very good community. And the reason I say that is because after hearing about her disappearance, the public did seem very keen to help the authorities find Alianna. Public tips would come in fast and heavy after this, and a local church known as the True Gospel Baptist, which is found along East 93rd Street, would in fact come back with a reported sighting of the young girl. The worrying thing here is that, although the footage was relatively unclear and almost out of view of the camera, detectives could finally see that, somewhere along her route, Alianna was no longer alone. The surveillance footage taken from this church would show her talking to what seemed to be a man. Now, it is worth noting here that this was recorded slightly before 7 AM. This means that, at the time, not only was the day already brightening up, but people were also awake and already commuting to work. In addition to this footage, an eyewitness claimed to see the pair walking together along 93rd Street. Apparently, they seemed quite comfortable together, and the man had his hand on her shoulder. Assuming that the two knew each other, this eyewitness thought absolutely nothing of it until seeing the news report the next day. I mean, after all, this interaction could have been as innocent as a father walking his daughter to school. But of course, if that really was the case, I wouldn't be here telling you this story today. This surveillance footage shows the unknown man talking to Alianna before she then takes a step back from him and decides to walk away. Despite this, he then calmly walked after her before taking her shoulder, before then leading her down Fuller Avenue, which is a side street just off of the main road. Unfortunately, this is where the surveillance footage of the two officially ends, and these grainy images show the last known sighting of Alianna while she was still alive. Honestly, it is chilling to imagine what may have been going through her mind while this stranger pulled her away. Now, we can all theorize what we would do in this situation, whether that's run away, kick and scream for help, or even fight our assailant. However, nothing can truly prepare you for such an instantaneous predicament. And we also have to remember that Alianna, she was only 14 years old, made extra vulnerable through her own conditions. So, who was this guy, and why did he pull her to the side, and what were his intentions? Detectives realized that he was pacing around the area where he abducted Alianna for several hours prior. Now, you have to remember that this was in the early hours of the morning, before anyone else was around. You can clearly tell that he was looking for something or someone. Despite learning these terrifying details, authorities were none the wiser about who this man was or where Alianna could be found. This of course leaving her parents absolutely distraught with fear. And unfortunately, the hours would tick by, eventually turning into days. Grainy images of the suspect were shared around the city, with detectives hoping for help from the general public. In the meantime, physical sweeps and searches were made along Fuller Avenue, which, of course, was the road that Alianna was led down. Through Google Maps and news reports, you can see that this road had issues. And while it did pave the way for a few beautiful homes, others lay abandoned or even non-existent at all, with several open plots of land where homes once stood before being torn down. During this time frame, officers went door to door, asking all neighbors if they witnessed anything shady on the day that Alianna disappeared. And for those houses without any residents, well, they decided to take a look inside once they had a permit. And that's when they came across 9412 Fuller Avenue. This one was a rundown and abandoned property, with boarded windows and decaying timbers from the roof. And although it was abandoned, it did actually belong to a contracting company. So unfortunately, the authorities could not simply walk in and look around. After 3 long days of waiting, authorities were finally able to ascertain a search warrant. And so, unsure of what to hope for or even expect, they began to search the home on January the 29th, 2017. And tragically, this is where they would find Alianna. 3 officers entered the property, prepared for whatever may wait them beyond the building's battered exterior. Curiously, the rear door of the property was already wide open, as if at some point in time it had been battered from the outside. There was no electricity to this residence, and so they used a flashlight to look inside instead. Detectives were immediately hit with the smell of blood, and at their feet was a crimson red trail leading from what they assumed to be the dining room and into another room nearby. That is where they noticed the blood trailing beneath the closed door. Prepared for the worst, they entered the room, and after following the blood trail, they would find her. Alianna was crumpled on the floor and in a pool of her own blood, clothed in only a pair of socks. All hope was immediately dashed from their minds. Her identity was soon confirmed by a medical examiner using her dental records. Forensic teams determined that she had been dragged and thrown into the room, hence the trail of blood that led to her discovery. Her blood-stained clothes and her backpack, still prepared for school, were also located in the property. It was evident that Alianna had suffered severe trauma not only to her head, but her body too. She had 4 puncture wounds to her cheeks, and a further sustained piercing wound to her forehead, one that was strong enough to penetrate her skull. It was also noted that her neck had suffered a deep laceration, and unfortunately, a lot of the details here have to be omitted as they are simply too terrible to share. Due to the extent of her injuries, it could not be determined what specifically caused her death, as sadly, it could have been multiple injuries or a combination of any of them. However, it was noted that some of her wounds did show initial signs of healing, meaning that she was alive for several hours after they were inflicted. A more comprehensive search of the home would reveal what tools her killer had used to inflict such cruelty. Found on the dining room table was a handheld drill, a screwdriver, and a box cutter. It was concluded that the injuries noted in the autopsy report did in fact match these instruments, and to make matters even worse, DNA was found inside her body. Now, this DNA would prove vital to catching her killer because, as we all know, previous sex offenders are all kept on a registry, with their DNA saved on the system, and this is precisely how they would catch her killer. Now, you would have thought that he would have been a little less stupid than this, but after running that DNA through the system, it would come back with one conclusive match. The man's name is Christopher Whitaker, and you can probably assume this, but he was already known by officers for all of the wrong reasons. As a 43-year-old man from Tennessee, he didn't have one but several previous convictions. Convictions which paint a very troubled and turbulent history. In the year 1998, he was charged with robbery, grand theft, and burglary, along with one charge of aggravated and felonious assault. Now, despite this being a very heavy offense, the case would eventually be dismissed. Fast forward to the year 2005, and Christopher was charged with sexual battery and felonious assault against a woman. It all started when he invited her into his home to use his bathroom, only to then proceed to threaten her with a pair of scissors, stab her in the neck, and then choke her before assaulting her. Thankfully, he would be sentenced for these crimes, but he would only serve 4 years for the attack. He was then released in the year 2009 and officially registered as a sex offender. Finally, in the year 2012, he was once again charged with aggravated theft, but he wouldn't serve any time for his offense in prison, leaving him free for the next 5 years into the year 2017, where he would then commit one more offense. With this information at hand, combined with the evidence both at the crime scene and on surveillance footage, Christopher would go on to be arrested on February the 2nd, that being only 3 days after police discovered Alianna's body. While in the interrogation room, it was noted that Chris's testimonies were murky and full of excuses. However, based on all of the evidence available, this is what we believe happened. To begin with, Alianna did successfully make it to her first bus stop. However, she was then intercepted by Christopher before she could reach the second. This surveillance footage shows Christopher approaching her outside of the True Gospel Baptist Church. It appears as if she got a bad impression of him, evident as she backed up and then tried to walk away. But you see, Christopher had already been pacing the area for several hours prior. It seems that he was not prepared to go home empty-handed, so instead, he intimidated her to get her attention. He then led her through a field towards Fuller Avenue, where the abandoned house sat vacant. I won't go into great detail about what happened inside the house, as you can probably make an educated guess based on the autopsy report. But after he was done, he then dragged her body deeper into the house before fleeing the scene. So, sick monster aside, what was Chris's motive, and did he have an excuse? Well, his answer may surprise you. Chris claimed that he was outrageously high on cocaine at the time, so high that he blacked out and couldn't remember a thing. Now, I won't disagree that blacking out can happen when you're ridiculously off your face. However, at least to me, these just sound like the words of a coward who refuses to look at the consequences of his actions. And after leaving her body all alone in that abandoned house, Chris then went on about his day as if absolutely nothing had happened. In fact, he would then go down to his local Baptist church and help out as pastor. To make matters worse, the pastor described his behavior as normal, if not a little calmer than usual. How someone can do something so sick and depraved and then just act totally fine is honestly beyond me. It became very clear that Chris has absolutely no regard for human life, and how one can claim they blacked out, yet then be cognizant only a few hours later That's just irrefutably a lie. While being interrogated, Chris told detectives that he couldn't have been the killer, as he was actually working on a job in the area at the time. Apparently, he was working on drywall, but the problem is that he had no alibi or contract to prove this. I can also imagine that working on drywall and also doing copious amounts of cocaine is not a typical mixture. I mean, considering how dumb this guy was, I would argue he would be more likely to mix the two substances by accident. Chris would regularly change his story too, muddling events and information, yet denying any involvement in her murder. That would go on for a while until eventually he realized that he had no chance in getting away with her death. And so that is when he would partially confess to officers, claiming that he had diminished responsibility after snorting a whole bunch of the white stuff. And I'm talking about cocaine here, not the drywall. Apparently, he blacked out just after punching Alianna. He then went on to say that he would have never committed such a crime if he had been sober. In fact, this is what he had to say.
People gonna look at me like a monster. I'm not a monster, I'm just an addict. I was so out of my mind, and it was like I was out of character. And I got what I got coming, and I deserve it. I will write a formal apology to her family that they probably don't want to hear, but I will do it anyway. I don't want a circus made out of this. I just want to go to court and get it over with. I don't remember what I did. I just remember when I came through that it had happened, and it was just disgusting.
With so much evidence pointing towards Christopher as her killer, it is kind of obvious how his trial would go. However, it is what happened after his trial that made this case quite different. But before we get to that, let's talk about his fate. Christopher's trial began on February the 1st, 2018. His defense team were well aware of the evidence against him, and so they didn't even bother to try and deny his involvement. Instead, they acknowledged his crimes, but they would also insist that the drugs made him unable to control his impulses or follow the law. Of course, the prosecution called bullshit instead. Assistant Prosecutor Mahmoud Awadallah stated, "The evidence does not point towards a drug-induced frenzy and does not point towards a blackout. Instead, it points towards the fact that he knows what he was doing." This was very evident in the vast selection of tools he had already at his disposal, and the surveillance footage showing him prowling the streets for several hours prior. To add to this, we have all seen a meth head on the streets before, and quite honestly, they simply do not shut up. However, those who saw Chris all claim that he was very calm and collected. And what's more, the precise placement of her wounds all indicate that he was methodically trying to kill her. This was a very calculated and brutal attack. During his trial, his defense team called no witness to the stand, probably because he had none, whereas the prosecution had many to go with. And so, only 2 days after his trial began, Christopher Whitaker was officially found guilty on 10 counts, including the kidnap, assault, and murder of Alianna DeFreeze. However, this would be where his defense team placed all of their eggs in one basket. As some of you will know, capital punishment is still a thing in Ohio, and they were desperately trying to avoid this for Christopher. His defense team argued that his drug usage, plus the fact that he confessed, should therefore mean that he should avoid the death penalty. However, after only 6 hours of deliberation, the jury suggested that, despite his defense team's best efforts, Christopher Whitaker should in fact receive the death penalty. And although the judge could technically have sentenced him to life imprisonment instead, she decided to agree with the jury. As a result, Chris was sentenced to death alongside a 48-year sentence, including a sizable list of other crimes comprised of aggravated burglary, sexual assault, felonious assault, obstruction of justice, and gross abuse of a corpse. Quite understandably, the final verdict came as a relief to Alianna's family, knowing that the man who took her away would now spend the rest of his numbered days behind bars. But of course, the pain and anger that they felt could never truly be paid for. After his sentencing, Alianna's mother would go on to say, "I appreciate the jury for their judgment and recommendation, but death is too good for him. I won't believe he has any remorse until he suffers like my daughter suffered. His apology means nothing to me." Her father would have similar sentiments, saying, "When you get where you're going to get what you got coming before you get the gas or lethal injection. My baby didn't have a chance." During the penalty phase of his trial, Christopher would go on to provide an unofficial statement to her family. He told them that he was genuinely remorseful and instructed his lawyers not to contest his charges at trial. However, it is worth noting here that his reasoning was so that this case would, quote, not become a circus. In my opinion, these were hollow words that still gave an air of diminished responsibility, and to me, sounded like he wanted to avoid being painted as a monster to the public. As an additional relief, Christopher's sentence was also welcome news to his assault victim from the year 2005, who, quite understandably, was also in full support of his death sentence. She believed that Chris would never stop as a free man, and believed that he should remain behind bars for the rest of his life. And despite telling his lawyers not to contest his charge, well, he would go on to change his mind and try to appeal in the year 2022. To everyone's relief here, the Ohio Supreme Court decided to reject this appeal. He is now imprisoned on death row at the Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Chillicothe, Ohio. The loss of Alianna DeFreeze was felt throughout the entire Cleveland community, and a memorial garden was erected in her place at her school by her classmates. As for her family, well, quite understandably, they harbored a lot of anger and grief. It became quite clear throughout the weeks and then months that there were many opportunities for other people to reduce the likelihood of her death. Now, quite obviously, there was a lot of criticism towards her school, and that's because despite promising her parents that they would call them if she ever failed to turn up to class, they didn't do this on the precise day that she was abducted. And the company that owned that abandoned property, well, they were also in very hot water here. And that's because they had failed to board it up correctly, therefore providing an environment that was ripe for terrible crimes. As a result, both entities were targeted in a lawsuit, with the city of Cleveland included for not effectively monitoring abandoned properties. And thankfully, this lawsuit ruled in favor of Alianna's family, who, as a result, received $1 million compensation. And this came as a great relief to Alianna's mother in particular, who, throughout the trauma and grief, stopped working, eating, and even sleeping. As a result of Alianna's death, Ohio Governor John Kasich signed a new law that required schools to call parents within 2 hours of the start of their school day if their child failed to attend without prior notice. This law, which is aptly named the Alianna Alert, became effective as of April 2019. Her family have also begun a non-profit foundation in her name named the Alianna DeFreeze Let's Make a Change Foundation. This organization aims to address the issues surrounding abandoned homes, and it further tries to help children obtain safe routes to school and address domestic violence in family homes. It is obvious to see that Alianna is missed dearly by her family, friends, peers, and the public at large. She truly was a cheerful, happy, and bubbly young girl who was simply making her way to school on an average day in the morning sun. Her mother describes her as a happy-go-lucky girl with not a bad bone in her body, one who loved her family, especially her little brother. If she was still alive today, Alianna would be 22 years old, and her family can only wonder where her life would have taken her. With a drive to help others, they have no doubt that she would have grown to be a warm light to anyone who knew her. But sadly, she would never be able to experience adulthood or the rest of her life. All of this was taken by a monster who valued a few minutes of his sick urges over an entire life. The only comfort that we have is that Christopher's life is also now over. And as for the abandoned homes found across Cleveland, well, they are also slowly disappearing too. In a desperate call for action against 9412 Fuller Avenue, the council finally agreed to tear it down. Videos of the horrific home being ripped apart have now surfaced online, and her family can finally take comfort in the fact that the dark walls their daughter saw in her final moments are now well and truly gone forever. And thankfully, many homes of a similar nature are following suit. This one was an incredibly painful story that left me feeling deeply sad. To the DeFreeze family, I really do hope that you're managing to find peace, and good on you for taking action against the homes, council, and school. With that said, I think I'll leave the story here today, folks, but before I go, I'd love to know what you think about this one. To begin with, do you think that Chris received the punishment he deserved? And also, what do you think about Cleveland's issue with abandoned homes? Before I sign off today, I'd like to remind you that I do have a Patreon where you get early access to my videos and additional content. With the move and everything, I've now kitted out a brand new studio, and so any donations on my Patreon will go directly towards creating more content. I do also often post my social media, most notably my Instagram. Nero seems to get a lot of camera time over there, so if you want to see more of him, please do check me out. It's at Coffeehouse Crime. And that is all I have today, folks. Thank you so much for being here, I really do appreciate it. And I'll see you again very soon for another video. Until that moment arrives though, remember to look after yourself, look after each other, and as always, stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.